Hey there, I'm garbly, and let's take a second to talk about CERB, or the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. If you were living in Canada and you were put out of work because of the COVID-19 or coronavirus pandemic, this was the $2,000 a month that you could collect, and it was basically like a guaranteed basic income that the federal government provided to Canadians who were put out of work. Now, obviously, musicians were unable to make a living during the pandemic, so you can bet a lot of us hopped on that. What was really interesting about CERB, though, as a recent article in the magazine Exclaim pointed out, is that CERB kind of acted as the first sense of financial stability for a lot of musicians and artists. And this is because in normal times, we don't actually make a very steady living. It usually comes in pretty big chunks at irregular intervals. So it's not always a very predictable financial career. So again, all that to say, CERB was like the most regular, stable thing for some people who were working as musicians, freelancers, etc. ever. So I'm filming this in about October, and CERB is like wrapping up. The government is going to transition it into this weird employment insurance thing. I don't really know how it's going to work, to be honest. But what has been interesting with CERB ending is there have been some proponents for just a guaranteed basic income or like a universal basic income, regardless of the pandemic. Basically just saying everyone gets their basic income covered, no questions asked. Some people say that universal basic services is better, so essentially receiving like housing, food, shelter, water, whatever, instead of an income to cover those things, but that's kind of a side point. For what I want to talk about, we can pretty much consider those the same thing. Anyways, that brings us to the question that I want to ask. Is universal basic income, or UBI, would that be a good thing for musicians? In short, I think the answer is yes, but let's take a closer look at why I think so. Okay, so I actually want to start this discussion off by looking at the opposing position to basic income. A lot of people who are against it, the counter argument that they give is that a universal basic income will disincentivize people from working. Basically, they say, oh, well, if you're making money guaranteed, you're not going to want to work, everyone's going to quit their jobs. There have actually been pilot projects with basic income in the entire world, and that does include both the United States and Canada. One of the more famous ones in Canada was the Mincome experiment in Dauphin, Manitoba. I think it was in the 70s. But even more recently in Ontario, there was a pilot project with universal basic income, although it was recently scrapped when the Conservative government took power in the province. So if we look at the Dauphin experiment in particular, mostly everyone actually kept their jobs. People didn't just quit because their lives were taken care of. If you look at the short term, though, you might try to say that it was bad economically because there was a slight dip. Some people did quit. But if you look at who it was that quit their jobs, it kind of made sense. A lot of this was like mothers who decided to stay home to take care of their children, or otherwise it was people who were like finishing up high school, who would have otherwise had part-time jobs, or people going to post-secondary. They were choosing to focus on their schooling. And in the long term, I think that's a really good thing because it allows people to focus on pursuing better paying jobs, which ultimately leads to more money for them, but also paying higher income taxes, which is good for the government as well. In general, it just kind of made life a little bit easier for everybody. With the Dauphin experiment still, there's a lot of other notable side effects that resulted from giving people a guaranteed basic income. One of them was that students actually scored better in school once they started to receive the basic income. And there's a lot of other interesting things too that Rutger Bretman talks about in his TED Talk here.
This story starts in Dauphin, Canada. In 1974, everybody in this small town was guaranteed a basic income, ensuring that no one fell below the poverty line. Evelyn Forget discovered that the people in Dauphin had not only become richer, but also smarter and healthier. The school performance of kids improved substantially. The hospitalization rate decreased by as much as 8.5%. Domestic violence incidents were down, as were mental health complaints. And people didn't quit their jobs. The only ones who worked a little less were new mothers and students, who stayed in school longer. Similar results have since been found in countless other experiments around the globe, from the US to India.
So we've seen that with the Dauphin experiment, at least, people didn't just up and quit their jobs once they started receiving basic income. And those of them who did, it was usually for good reasons, to kind of better themselves. Let's zoom in back onto musicians again. If you've ever tried to learn to play an instrument, you know that it takes a lot of effort to even become a little bit decent at playing it. Like, you really have to put in literally thousands of hours of practice to get good at it. And then if you're an artist too, you can add on the time that it takes to hone your songwriting craft and to kind of find your own musical voice or musical niche. And if you're an independent artist, you also need to put time in to figure out your branding. The key word here is that it takes a lot of time to do all these things. So if you're really lucky, maybe you figure out that music is your absolute passion, the one thing you want to do with your life when you're like 3, while you're still dependent on your parents, and you're able to put in all that free time towards working on your instrument and branding yourself as an artist. Great. But if you figure it out a little later that you want to pursue music, like say when you're nearing adulthood, you might realize that you don't have as much time as you think. Why is that the case? Well, once you're not dependent on your family or your parents anymore, you need to start paying for stuff yourself. And for most people, that means you need to get a job because that's how you make money. And most jobs require you to work like 40 hours a week, which is a lot of time that you can't put towards practicing music. It's not very complicated. So one of the first obvious benefits of like an extended CERB or just a guaranteed UBI is that it provides for your basic needs and you're able to put all of your free time into pursuing your craft. Basically, instead of working that service job, like being a waiter or kitchen staff, whatever, that you really don't like, you can just focus all your energy into pursuing music and developing as an artist. And if you're one of those people who decides to go to music school because you want to pursue music like that, a UBI would help avoid or at least alleviate the massive amounts of debt that most people have to take on to be able to go to post-secondary. It's really important to note that developing a career in music usually takes a lot of time. Like, no one really immediately starts making a full-time living, myself included. So one of the other things that UBI would do is kind of help tide you over until you actually make money from your music. I think there are also a couple things very particular to this particular era that UBI would help alleviate as well. One of the first things to note is that musicians tend to go to pretty large cities. If you're like a freelance gigging musician, that tends to be where the work is found. And if you're like an artist, there's usually more industry connections in larger cities than like in small towns. But cities have gotten more and more and more expensive over the years, and general wage hasn't really gone up a whole lot. That's one of the first things that UBI would help with, is just being able to afford to live in one of the big cities as a musician. And if you're an original artist whose focus is to make money off writing your own songs and distributing them or selling them, although no one really buys music anymore, or playing shows, etc., we know that it's almost impossible to make any meaningful amount of money from recorded music nowadays. Like, everyone's always complaining about how Spotify absolutely pays balls nothing to original artists. And so even as like a recording artist, it's kind of hard to make money from the get-go. So that's another thing that UBI can help with, is just keep yourself afloat while you're developing your career. I want to go back to the opposing side's arguments on this for a second. So some opponents of basic income for musicians would say that the financial competition in capitalism is necessary because it drives people to work harder, to practice more, to focus on their craft, and become the best musicians they can be. Now, I partly disagree with this. Let me explain what I mean. So I do think competition in abstract can be a good motivator for people. You know, consider sports. That's kind of the whole reason you practice and work hard and want to do well, right? You want to win that next hockey or basketball game against your opponents. That's what drives you to do better and to practice and to work hard. Where I disagree with this, though, is I don't think that the competition needs to be a financial one to motivate people. Essentially, that's what we have in capitalism right now. But what's also important to note is that under capitalism, we also need to make money in order to simply survive. Like, we have to pay rent, we have to pay mortgages, we have to pay for food, we have to pay off loans, etc., etc. So does this mean that like a musician who's slightly less talented than the best one out there doesn't get to live a decent life as a human being just because they're the theoretical loser of that financial competition? I don't think that's completely fair. Besides, we can still have competitions in music that aren't about money. You know, for example, if you're taking a drumming class and there's another guy in there, you might have just a healthy rivalry with that person and see who can learn the next hard song the fastest. Not all competitions have to be about money. And to go back to sports, sports at its heart isn't even about money. It's a competition to see who can win the game, right? I think one of the pitfalls too of saying that we have to be motivated by financial need as musicians is that we also start to run the risk of judging the quality of someone's art or music based on their financial success rather than their actual artistry or musicianship. So for example, if we talk about the composer Bach, he was actually really not that well known, not really wealthy, and kind of an obscure composer in his own lifetime. His own sons were more famous than him, actually. Today, though, we tend to consider Bach one of the greatest composers of the Baroque era. If you're familiar with the sociologist Max Weber, there's kind of a similar phenomenon happening in his analysis of the rise of Protestantism. Basically, he said that people started to see financial success as an indicator that God had chosen them and that they were going to be saved in the afterlife and they were going to go to heaven. And so a lot of people started to pursue financial success for that reason. Weber said that's one of the reasons that capitalism really rose as an economic model in the world. And that danger also applies to music too. Maybe you're just going to try to pursue financial success instead of really just developing your art. One of the last good arguments I want to put in favor of UBI for musicians is that by making us more financially stable, we're less vulnerable, and it gives us more power in terms of being laborers. So, for example, if you're a freelance musician who's playing kind of any kind of gig, you're probably not going to be very picky when you're first starting out because you want to make money. And a lot of the gigs that pay very well are perhaps not the most interesting ones.
Definitely my favorite video of yours, basically talking about why you hate contemporary Christian worship. And for anybody out there who hasn't seen the video, it's not what you might be thinking. By the way, I just described it. It is incredibly well thought out. It is articulate.
Thank you.
It's not offensive in any way. It's not inflammatory in any way, but you were able to put my feelings about that genre and that experience of playing for about 5 or 6 years. That's what I did almost full time. Like almost every gig I did was in these massive mega churches, playing for tens of thousands of people every weekend, these huge stages, full on production, the whole deal, playing music that was so, in my opinion and experience, lacking and restrictive. And I didn't know how to articulate that. And then you put out this video and I literally was just sitting there screaming at my computer like, yes, yes.
So that wedding gig that is a little boring maybe pays a lot more, like in the hundreds of dollars, versus the really cool progressive indie rock band that your friend is playing with tomorrow night, but can maybe only pay you a cut of the door. I think having UBI would allow you to be more picky about the types of gigs you take on. And that's ultimately a good thing, because if you're enthusiastic about the music you'll play, you'll put in more work and it'll lead to a higher quality performance or higher quality music being written. One of the other things that comes with financial stability is you don't have to accept bad paying gigs if you don't want to, right? Because you don't need the money as much. You can say no to gigs that don't pay well. And that should generally make gigs better paying for everyone, because everyone can be pickier about their minimum threshold for what they want to get paid. And financial stability is really good for original artists too, because it means there's less pressure to accept bad deals from record labels in order to achieve that financial stability. Essentially, you can make better choices for your career in the long term because you're not pressured into taking every single little opportunity that comes your way, even if it rips you off. So, overall, to sum it up, I think that it's extremely clear. From my point of view, a universal basic income would be extremely beneficial to musicians and artists, and for a few key reasons. The first one is that it would give us some sense of financial stability, and the second one is that it would give us more power as laborers. And I think that's really important because it probably would help to reduce some of the shady stuff that happens in this industry, and there's definitely a lot that happens. I want to know what you think though. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have a counter argument as to why you think this is actually a bad idea? Please let me know in the comments, because I want to talk about universal basic income some more. If you enjoyed this video, watching this video, please take a second to like, to subscribe, and to hit that bell so you get notifications when I post more content like this. My name's Gab Lavoie. It has been a pleasure, and I will see you the next time. Goodbye.